Welcome to Inspiring STEM's podcast program discussing innovations in scientific publishing and science communications. We are interviewing key opinion leaders and organisations working to advance and quite often to disrupt the status quo. My name is Martin Delahanty and I will be your host. In this episode, I'm meeting with James Butcher, who has spent the past 20 years working at two of the most influential scientific publishers, first as executive editor at the Lancet, and then as the leader of the Nature journals. James now works as a strategy consultant with Clarke and Esposito, helping editors and publishing professionals create impactful scholarly journals through consulting, coaching, and speaking. A very warm welcome, James, to the programme.
Oh, thank you very much, Martin. Always good to speak to you.
And likewise. It's always nice to start off with a new guest, just to know a little bit more about your background and what led you into academic publishing and a little bit about your current work.
Sure. Well, I guess you and I go back quite a long way. I was trying to think it through. It's probably about 20 years. And I started academic publishing a little bit before that. So my PhD is in neurophysiology. So I spent 3 years in the lab. And at the end of it, I really didn't want to be in a dark room on my own anymore. So I was looking for new things to do. And originally I wanted to be a journalist. So I did things like the Daily Telegraph Young Science Writer Awards, doing some competitions for that and didn't get very far. But I got through as a finalist, but didn't win anything. But it kind of gave me a taste for journalism, publishing, that kind of thing. And I ended up first as a medical writer at what is now Sanofi Aventis, what's then Sanofi Synthélabo. I did that for a year, worked for a popular science magazine called Inside the Human Body that was definitely lowbrow. Before getting, in many ways, a dream job as an editor at the Lancet in 2000. So I was one of the news editors. I was also doing peer review. And of course, back then, 2000 was the time when the human genome was published actually in Nature that year. So I was there at the press conference with all the other journalists covering the human genome, which was really, quite a way to kick off a career in science publishing. So I spent, 6-7 years at the Lancet. I launched the Lancet Neurology as the chief editor. So I did lots of peer review, lots of writing, and it was a really fun time. I then worked for myself for a bit and then got to a job at what was then Nature Publishing Group as the publisher of their Nature clinical practice journals, or at least that's what they were called then. We rebranded them to Nature Reviews, and they've gone from strength to strength off the back of that. I got involved in the early years of Nature Communications and Scientific Reports, and then moved over to helping to launch new Nature journals and writing proposals for that. So I think we did 26 Nature journals, new Nature journals, while I was there looking after that. So I learned a lot about lots of different bits of science. So I still think of myself as a scientist, which is ridiculous because I haven't done any science for 25 years or whatever. But it's in my blood in many ways. And, that kind of scientific process, I think is really important to the way that I try and go about things. So for example, writing proposals for journals. So I've worked in open access. I've been an editor. I've been a publisher. I think probably the editors think I'm too commercial. The commercial people think I'm too editorial. I don't really know what I am. I'm a strange mix of experiences, I guess. So I was at Nature until, where are we now? So last February, I guess, something like that. So it's been about 18 months where I've been working with Clarke and Esposito as a consultant and also doing my own thing with the Journalology Newsletter, which perhaps we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's been a fun 18 months. I'm learning new things all the time, and that's what makes me happy.
And of course, we all want to be happy in our work, and it's reflective also in obviously the work that you've done, which is an incredible just sort of run through your background working for the Lancet and then Nature and the work that you're doing, but taking you up to the work that you have been doing since you left Nature, both working for Clarke and Esposito and Journalology. It's the work that you've been sharing and the insights that you've been sharing have been very very important, I think, and very well appreciated. And I think in the era of now, in the era of AI and generative text tools, very hard to get away from that. It's been so refreshing to read your weekly and human-curated newsletter, Journalology. So definitely, we'd like to know a little bit more how did that develop, and what are your objectives for Journalology?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. So I bought the domain name probably over 10 years ago. So it's always been something at the back of my mind that I'd quite like my personal little space on the internet. I mean, I guess one of the things that I think has benefited my career over the years, and I would advise, anyone perhaps at the start of their career to think about, is just to read as much as possible. So over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I've created a list of RSS feeds, which provide news wires, press releases, opinion pieces, that kind of thing well, it used to be Google Reader, but obviously it's all changed now with that shut down many years ago. But that ability to be able to synthesize and read lots of different things and try and make sense of it is something that I've always enjoyed doing. And as we explained in the introduction, I started after my PhD. I wanted to write. I wanted to be a journalist. It's the way that I feel that I can express myself best. I enjoy writing. I enjoy the process of writing. I find that it's not until I write about something that I really properly think about it. So, I mean, yes, obviously, I'm doing it because I want to build an audience and all the things that consultants need and want to do. But actually, in many ways, the main reason I'm doing it is because I enjoy it. It's I wouldn't call it a hobby because it's a bit more than that, but it's something that I enjoy doing every week. So, for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, basically it's a newsletter. So every week or most weeks, I send out an email to the subscribers. So it's free to subscribe, doesn't cost anything. And I try and summarize the week's news, the opinion articles that are coming through, but often do at the beginning kind of my own. I wouldn't call it an article or an essay. It's often a bit shorter than that, but something that's a piece of analysis or something that I've seen in the news that I want to riff off or just explain a little bit more about. And I think we need more sharing in our industry. I mean, in terms of thoughts and ideas. It's very hard when you've got a full-time job. So, the reason I never did it when I was, gainfully employed at a publisher was I just didn't have time, right? There was no time when you're in a senior management position like that to be able to really engage and think in a written form like that. And that's, I guess, one of the real pleasures and advantages of being a consultant is that you have to know what's going on. You have to have a sense of what's interesting and have an opinion on that. And so the newsletter's a way for me to, I hope, become a better consultant, coach, that kind of thing. Just be able to have a sense of where the industry is going, because actually a lot of people actually working in the industry just don't have time, quite understandably, don't have time to keep up. So if I can help in some way, that's a win in my view.
Yeah, exactly. And it's having that time in whatever sector of the academic scholarly publishing community you are to parse through the huge volume of weekly data. It's just very hard to keep up. And I think what's still good in these, again, sort of AI focused times is that accredited knowledge and information is still centered around people that we trust and know, like yourself. Understanding your background and taking note of the notes that you add. You said they're not essays; they're just brief sort of annotations to whatever has already been shared. Generally, it reminds me of Waterstones and going into Waterstones and seeing the
True, actually, I haven't thought of that, but you're right.
The selected picks from staff and the notes that they write there, or a vinyl record shop, which is kind of coming back into place now. Having those additional notes from an expert that says you will like this information, or this information is you should take account for it. So I mean, it's great to see that is taking off, and you've posted on LinkedIn some of the great testimonials as well. But I guess behind that, it is you. But I'm going to ask whether you're thinking about using any kind of AI tool to help you do what you do as a human being.
I am definitely behind the times when it comes to experimenting with AI. I guess even if I could, I'm not sure. Even if it worked, I'm not sure to what degree I would want to. And I think this is something that, it's a really interesting point when we think about academia more broadly. For me, the point of writing isn't necessarily to try and express my views to other people. I mean, obviously that's the output, but it's to help me to think things through. And maybe AI will be able to, or, various tools will be able to let me to do that more effectively. I haven't really experimented with it very much, mainly because I don't really have a desire to. It's enjoyable. What I do now is enjoyable. It's fun. It's interesting. Maybe I'm missing out, or maybe I need to experiment more. But I think, when we think about the way that large language models and other forms of new technology are going to affect academia, I do worry that process of thinking things through and writing a narrative and explaining your results in context of what others have done before will miss something if it's all automated. I mean, I completely appreciate that, for people whose, first language isn't English, it can be a massive advantage. And there are lots of other good things for it. But surely or at least historically, the purpose of being an academic is to think and to write and to express yourself. And I think if we lose the essence of that in the future, I think we'll have lost something important. But maybe I'm just towards the end of my career and I'm a little bit older behind the times. I don't know. I'm quite happy if that's the case. But for me, I think the writing and thinking are intricately linked.
Yeah, I agree. So I think you've still got a long way to go, James, in your career. So I wouldn't worry about that.
Yeah, with 2 young kids, I've definitely got a fair way to go.
So I did also want to move on to talk about open access publishing, and you and I were there at Nature in the early years, where there was a lot of thinking, quite in-depth thinking around how to approach open access publishing. At I guess the very beginning of a transformation that we're already seeing right now. So I mean, open access is dominating and transforming publishers' editorial and business models. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the current state of play for open access.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a really interesting time in the open access story, which really has been going on for pretty much my entire career. But I think, one of the concerns that a lot of people had at the beginning was, for publishers, you publish more papers, you make more money, right? It's the simplest business model in many ways. That revenues are directly proportional to how many articles you as a publisher. And that creates, an incentive to publish more papers, particularly for commercial publishers, but also for, not-for-profits that want to maintain market share and market position. And so over time, what we've ended up with is an APC-based economy where publishers are paid per article. And that has had unintended consequences. I mean, let's just step back a bit. Open science and open access is clearly the way forward and the way things need to be, right? To my mind, there's no discussion about whether we should do it. It's a question of how we do it, and how we do it in a way that's equitable, sure, but it also has to work for the publishers. And I think one of the things that we as an industry, the publishing industry, have done a really bad job of is explaining the costs of publishing, all of the intricacies that go in behind it, why it's important. There's lots of negative comments about profit margins and those kind of things, which, is fair comment. We can have a conversation about that. But I think there's also an underlying misunderstanding of how to do publishing right at the moment, at least costs money. And those costs need to be covered some way. So I think there's lots of tensions with open access. And I think the one that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, because of my background, basically, is this tension, this new tension between editorial and publishing. that was there at the start of my career, at least in the medical space, with display advertising. So, you'd never, as a medical journal, have an advert from a pharmaceutical company immediately opposite on a print page back in the day when print pages really mattered. Opposite a randomized controlled trial for the same drug or disease. You just wouldn't do it. And obviously the advertising people didn't like that because they could make more money if they could put those adverts across. But there was this firewall between editorial and publishing, or editorial and commercial sides. And it worked, relatively well. There were some disagreements, but generally everyone understood where the line was. I think it's a lot more of a grey area now. And, we can see with the recent, one's called them spate, it's only 3 or 4, but, resignations of editorial boards, where publishers are asking editors to publish more papers than they did previously. And understandably, our editors are pushing back and saying, no, we care about quality, we care about impact, and often they care about impact factor. They shouldn't, but they do. And that creates this tension, which is unfortunate because, the underlying requirement for open access and open science is incredibly important. And we need to, as a wider community, whether publishing and academia, and funders and everyone else, find a way through it.
And as you say, it's become a volume game, which creates this added tension between editorial and the the commercial publishing side. So, I mean, how do you see that playing out? Because it clearly, as you say, there's a cost to publishing. There's also, I guess, a narrative that all good research should be published, and I guess a discussion that has been ongoing as what is the need now for these highly selective journals, with very small acceptance rates. Is there a need for these? If I could call them glamour journals, you
didn't. You can if you want to.
I've just done that. So in the the age of wanting to make sure that all good science, all good data is published to maintain to create sustainability in the scientific endeavor, to avoid replication of studies that have already been done. Is there a role for a selective journal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very biased because I've spent 20 years working on them, and I'm sure my response to that question will be marked by those experiences. I mean, I think selective journals are incredibly valuable because the work that is going to be most impactful to the scientific community, and I don't mean citations, I mean in terms of methodology that's going to be adopted elsewhere, that kind of thing, it needs scrutiny. I think for me, the real question is whether or not we need, the standard publishing process for where the vast majority of scientists publish. And I include myself for my PhD. The work that I was doing was incredibly niche. There were probably 10 other labs in the world that were interested in it. Did my paper need to be published in a formal journal with all of the costs and the peer review involved in that or not? I'm not sure if it did. And I think, a lot of the discussions around preprints and, peer reviewing preprints rather than, formal submissions through to journals. For me, the interesting bit of that is around where most scientists publish, i.e. at the bottom of the pyramid. There's a lot of talk about at the top of the pyramid, so the Cells, the Natures, the Sciences, the Lancet, New England journals. I actually think those journals provide value because we need the extra scrutiny that those really visible papers will have, and also because of the ability for that work to actually be seen. So, I mean, often and it is an approximation, but when I'm asked what do publishers do, what do editors do, I narrow it down to 3 things. They do a lot more than this, but it's a simple way of getting across. It's filter, enhance, amplify. So, selecting for readers what is the most interesting, or at least in the opinion of the editors, the most interesting piece of research or review opinion, making it better. So that's through editorial review, through peer review, through Maybe it's artwork, some additional extra resources in terms of copy editing, that kind of thing. But actually, I think the thing that everyone forgets, but is actually the most important, I would argue, thing that a lot of these selective journals do is amplify. If you get published in these journals, you get noticed. And I don't know if you saw I'm sure you did, the Coalition S data that came out recently, where for the first time you could really properly have a look at usage. I mean, I say that it's not entirely clear the publishers provided the usage data, so it may well be that it's not all counter compliant, and you're comparing with apples with pears. But broadly speaking, it gives you a sense of the level of traffic to journals like Nature and the Nature Research journals is absolutely enormous. And that is through, that's not just through the brand, although that's partly it, developed over decades. But it's about the website. It's about the press team working in the background. It's about, you as an academic, you want to get published in Nature because it helps your CV, but also because it means that people read it and see it, and and it's important work that deserves to be read and seen. The sort of stuff that I was doing in my PhD didn't require that level of amplification because it was just too niche. So I think the amplify function is a really interesting one and a very important one that publishers do. And I think publishers that are unable to amplify the work that gets submitted to them are going to struggle in the future, because otherwise, why not just put it on a preprint server, in a big vat of content where perhaps it will rise to the top, or maybe it won't get noticed. It's a way of showcasing and amplifying a message, and I can't see that disappearing. I mean, maybe you don't need to publish the paper in order to do the amplification. Maybe various discussions over the years about papers can be published in the equivalent of preprint servers or databases, and then the publications like Nature can go in there and flag stuff and say, this is interesting, this is cool. Maybe that will happen further down the line. It wouldn't surprise me if perhaps it does one day, but I think we're a fair way away from that at the moment.
Yeah. Well, they're great points, particularly amplification point, and I'll share a link to the Coalition S data so people can look at that as well. But that's really interesting in relation to that amplification of scientific researchers' work. But of course, the other discussion maybe coming back to that we should have is around assessment of researchers' work. And we mentioned that the impact factor doesn't matter. Of course, it matters, but we've had that discussion for decades, and there's always a discussion about a better way for researchers to be assessed other than publication citations. But do you see any real changes happening?
Honestly, I'm not sure if I do. I mean, COARA, is that how you pronounce it? The Coalition on, can't remember what the A stands for, research assessment. I think they're doing some important work, and I think that could change things. I mean, it has to come from the funders. I mean, fundamentally, the way that academics are assessed has been outsourced to publishers to a large degree. The publishers haven't designed that system; they benefited from it, but that's the way that it's currently set up. If it's changed in the future, then that could very well change the current setup and the importance of different journal tiers. We will have to see. I think academia is quite a slow-paced thing. It's not something which tends to change quickly. I'm sure it will change at some point. It's just a question of when and how quickly. I think for me, though, the thing that won't go away, and this, a lot of people disagree with this and it's unpopular, but brands. I've thought about this a lot over the years, but I think that brands are just inherent into human nature. Everything that we do as humans has some level of branding, depending on, I don't know, the type of baked beans you buy in the supermarket, or the car that you buy, or the watch that you buy, or whatever. That's how we signal to each other as human beings with brands. And the idea that there would be a scientific communication system without any sense of branding or tiering, or it'd be in a completely egalitarian I just can't see it. I just don't think that's how we operate as human beings. Maybe we should, but I don't think we do. I think we always have value judgments based on branding and positioning and tiering. So it may well change, but I think there are some things that won't change. And I think signaling to readers and to funders, this is interesting, this is important. It doesn't have to be done by publishers. It could be done in some other way, but I can't see that disappearing. People's always going to want to know what's important, what's cool, what's cutting edge. I can't see that changing.
I agree. I don't say that changing at all. And come back to experts with the research for background that you have to make those judgments on what is interesting and what people should pay attention to. Another challenge I wanted to touch on was research integrity. So we've seen some significant challenges to journals and publishers' research integrity in relation to retractions of articles, and sometimes a conflation of open access publishing with poor or fraudulent or predatory publishing. So, what are your thoughts on some of we don't need to mention those particular instances, but so generally, so the level of traction seems to have been increasing, and then the effects for publishers and journals has in some cases been quite dramatic, with some journals ceasing to publish. So what are your thoughts on the state of play for journals and research integrity?
Anyone who thinks they haven't got a problem is probably lying to themselves, because I think it's a problem for everyone. So, I think those publishers that have had, public issues, I think the important thing is to deal with it. And actually the openness and transparency that has happened on some occasions, I think, is to really be commended. I think that's something that is not easy to stand up and say, we've been hit by a paper mill, we've got these problems, but we're dealing with it, particularly when it hits your financial bottom line. I think that's something that, we need to be creating a culture where, well, ideally, publishers obviously prevent the problem before it started. We can come on to that in a minute. But, when there are problems, what we can't have is a situation where people are hiding stuff because they're worried about what that might mean for their reputation. I mean, it's the wrong thing to do. And it's the wrong thing for our industry, but also for the brand. And I think, I come back to research integrity and what a lot of publishers are already doing it, but it needs investment. It needs people. It needs technology. And I think, all the discussions about profit margins, for example, I think, there's a real case for investing in sorting out research integrity problems. Because if you don't have a brand and you don't have a business. So I think from a purely business point of view, publishers, most of them already are putting, significant sums into research integrity teams in terms of technology investment to try and spot troublesome papers up front. Because prevention is obviously, the ideal. The problem we've got now is large language models are almost certainly going to increase the prevalence of this kind of problem. But why are people making up papers and submitting them? Because they need them for their CV and for academic tenure and for all the things that we talked about in terms of research assessment.
Yes.
So it always comes back to the research assessment problems. People are fabricating results or bending the rules or doing things that they shouldn't because they're under pressure to perform. And that system is counterproductive. I think, the way where it starts getting really interesting with large language models and what this means for scholarly publishing is the value of having a clean data set is going to become more and more important. In other words, the value of, let's call it peer review, but the value of assessment, the value of saying this paper is probably, I wouldn't say correct because that's not the way science works, but we've done some checks and balances, and we're as confident as we can be with the technology that this is a kosher paper. That will become increasingly valuable. If you end up with an open platform that is full of stuff which isn't true and is fabricated, that actually becomes a lot less valuable for AI companies and LLMs. So you've got this tension again between, that means that perhaps some scholarly publishers are going to be looking to keep hold of the rights of the stuff that they publish, because they may have some commercial implications further down the line through licensing for AI. When what we all know is the right thing to do is to make it open access and open science, and to push that agenda forward. So I think there are some tensions, some new tensions that have arisen in the last 6 months around what this rapidly changing new technology will mean for publishers, but also for academia and the scholarly record. And if I can just finish off, a little bit of a hobby horse, we often have conversations about green open access, which is the author-accepted manuscript. That I often describe it as the Word file, the pre-accepted version, and the version of record. And I think the version of record has real value, and that's, in my opinion, the version that should be made open access. I've seen too many examples over the years, and particularly in the medical space, where you get the difference between milligram and microgram wrong, and it's picked up at the editing process, and the authors have made a mistake in a clinical paper. That's a problem, right? I mean, that's potentially damaging to patients. Quality control is really important, and I think if we lose that in some way in the future, that's a problem. Good enough in some areas of science perhaps is okay. In other areas and particularly I'm thinking in the clinical sciences, it's not okay. It needs to be correct, and that needs to be thought through and paid for, frankly. And I think there is more and more requests for extra checks, extra balances, extra things for publishers to do. Quite rightly and understandably, but all of these things cost money. And so, we have APCs that are high and are difficult for authors in many regions of the world to find the funds for. But all of this quality control needs to be paid for in some way. So that needs to be worked out and thought through. And we can't keep asking editors in particular to do more and more and more, but without giving them more resources. And there's a pressure on APCs to come down. So I think tension is the word that I always keep coming back to at the moment in our industry. There's just so many different tensions between different stakeholders.
I agree. And I mean, it's quite extraordinary to think that if we were having this conversation 12 months ago, it's probably unlikely we'd be talking about AI or AI-powered tools, and now it's unavoidable. So you touched on large language models, and obviously there are other types of AI-powered tools, machine learning tools that are now being explored, tested, adopted by publishers. Have you seen anything that hasn't particularly impressed you? Is there anything that you might sort of flag up as particularly interesting to the academic and scholarly community?
I mean, everything that I've seen so far, and I'm not as up to date with this as, I'm not a technologist. It's not something that I really follow. But for example, problems with hallucinations, which I'm sure will get sorted out. But at the moment, making up references is not a good look, right? When you've got a large language model that is fabricating references in order to back up an argument, I mean, that's clearly a significant problem. All of these things will get ironed out. As I say, I'm a scientist, which means I'm skeptical about a lot of things. I think there's a lot of hype, lots of discussion about how AI will change everything, and I'm sure it will in some way. But to try and make predictions at this point without actually seeing it in action over a period of probably years, and what the unintended consequences of some of that might be, I am perhaps wrongly but wary of jumping to too many conclusions. But maybe there'll be something that will leap out and we'll just say that's that completely changes the way that things are done. I mean, one thing that I come back to sometimes is, at various times over the years, I've been involved in discussions about the paper of the future, right? This put it in air quotes. What will the paper of the future look like? And we always, the current IMRAD, introduction methods results discussion. works quite well for human readers. And humans are storytellers naturally. So, a scientific paper is basically a story. And I've always struggled to see how that will change. I think for me, what would be really interesting is if actually science isn't written for humans anymore. It's actually written for machines. And then you end up with an output where, okay, the scientists have done the experiment, but maybe the output is written not with a human in mind, but with a database in mind and the need for mining. And actually, the humans aren't reading the primary resources anymore. They're coming back a bit. That would change everything. But I think using models to try and improve or speed up the process of writing and publishing and quality control, yeah, I'm sure it will help things, but will it radically change things? I don't know. It's too early to say. We're on a wave.
We're on a wave, yes. And for those of us familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, we're on that sort of wave of expectation, getting to the top to look at the trough of disillusionment.
I should say, Martin, and everyone should bear this in mind, this little story in mind in terms of my predictions. So I remember the first time I ever saw the internet. Okay, it was 1995. I just finished my my exams, my finals, and one of my lecturers, a guy called Christoph Schweining, took me and maybe two or three others into his I'm not sure if it was his office or his lab. It was tiny, this tiny little room. And he had a computer on his desk, and he was incredibly excited about his webpage, his homepage for his lab. And he was explaining how this thing called the internet was going to change everything, and how he could see other people, other labs around the world, what they're up to, and how it was just incredible. And I distinctly, and I'm not making this up, I distinctly remember thinking, well, that's a ridiculous idea. It's never going to work. So with that in mind, my predictions for what might happen with LLMs and others, I think, probably should be disregarded. To be honest, we'll have to see.
We'll have to see. James, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for that. It'd be nice to know what you're up to over the coming months, and maybe where people might be able to see you or hear you, apart from Journalology, which again I'll make sure I include the link to Journalology so people can sign up and subscribe to that. But what else are you going to be up to over the next few months?
Yep, so I will be in Manchester at ALPS. I never quite say ALPS, but you know what I mean. Association of Learned Professional Society Publishers, I think is the acronym. So that's in Manchester in September, so I will be there. I probably won't be at the Frankfurt Book Fair, I don't think. I've got a few other speaking things coming up that are closed rather than public. I think I might be doing a webinar with Ease later in the year, just in discussions about that. So yeah, a few things coming up, but Manchester in September is probably the next conference I'll be at.
Great. Okay, James, again, thank you so much for this conversation. Maybe we'll come back early next year and see how things are doing. But for the moment, thank you again. I'll make sure to include links to you and to all the mentions in the podcast today. But we look forward to the next conversation.
Oh, thanks, Martin. It's always fun to speak to you, so I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, James.